No Box Dance presents Dance Behind the Screen, process production, and social media. Don't forget, say no to the box. Dile no a la caja. 고정관념이란 상자에서 벗어나세요.
Welcome back to Dance Behind the Screen podcast. This is your host, Marthea. In season 6, our theme is dance and technology. Our goal this season is to talk about how dance can coexist in a world of screens, social media, and interactive and immersive environments. On our show, we talk about dance behind the screen. For me, this book, Pilobolus, A Story of Dance and Life, reveals what happens behind the shadows of the rebellious dance company, Pilobolus. On today's show, I am excited to welcome back the artistic director of Pilobolus, Matt Kent, and a new guest, the author of Pilobolus, A Story of Dance and Life, Robert Pranzatelli. Welcome to our show, Matt and Rob. I'm excited to have you here.
Thanks for having us.
I'm excited to be here.
I know in the book you met at a workshop over the summer, but to give our audience a bit of context, can you briefly share your relationship to each other and Pilobolus?
Yeah, I could start by saying that from the very first page of the book, the opening scene is the night I first saw Pilobolus in the 1990s. And Matt was on stage as a very young dancer. He was new to the company. And I was impressed by him, but I didn't meet him until many years later. So I tell that story in the first chapter of the book. And eventually what happened was I took a workshop with Pilobolus that was taught by Matt, and his wife, Emily, is another person who is a leader in Pilobolus. And in addition to the workshop being very transformative and profound for me, the surprise was that I immediately felt a kindred spirit or kinship with the two of them. And that led me to do something that I think maybe most people probably would think you're not supposed to do, which is you're a paying customer at a workshop and you can't really expect the instructors to want to be your friend for the rest of their lives. But I somehow transgressed that boundary. And over time, we became friends. And we've known each other for many years now. And I would characterize my friendship with Matt as a very sweet, brotherly kind of friendship. And by that, I mean it's the kind of friendship where you can say anything to each other, you can confess anything, confide. When you're having a hard time, that person's there for you. When you're having a good time, you want to share it with them. I think it's partly that he has a younger brother who he loves. I have a couple older brothers who I love. And I think we both value that kind of fraternal solidarity and friendship. So that's part of it. And part of it is also that we're both artists and we can just talk endlessly to each other about the creative process or what we're working on or what we want to work on or what we just saw or read or heard from some other artist. So it's a really great connection. And so I use that story a little bit to frame the book at the beginning and in a few passages.
I think that special relationship is very important. And I think those types of relationships aren't often talked about as much in terms of what goes on behind the scenes for different organizations and even just relationships in general, how those can nurture and create something maybe unexpected like this book. Matt, can you talk a little bit about your experience meeting Rob?
Sure, gladly. First of all, yes, I do agree with Robert that it is a fraternal, familial, in many ways, relationship that we have that I was thinking we were talking before. So I'm out in Baton Rouge, we're out with the company. And before I left, we had a chat, as we often do on the weekends these days, between dropping kids off and making new work and jobs and life and everything. But we usually find a time to talk. We probably talk once a week, something like that when we can. And I was thinking about how our relationship, I can't think like many or the relationships that kind of grow organically out of some overlap in interest. And I think it started, I don't know, Robert's taking the workshop and he was creative and interesting and not a dancer. Like, it wasn't like, oh, this is a fellow dancer. It's like somebody in a different field. And that's what can be really interesting, because you start to talk about principles and like the art, the way all arts and things like overlap. And I for some reason, I remember driving Robert to the hotel he was staying at because it was so close to my house. And there's always those like little, like these little, you called it a transgression, not really, these little borders that you start to become, that become permeable. And we'd sit in the car, we'd drive, and I'd play music, and Robert would put on some French pop music, and I'd play some latest album I was listening to. We'd talk about music, just like normal stuff like that. And it just, there was no moment where we went, oh, we're this kind of friends now. It just happened. But I will say that from the very beginning, Robert's take, his like perspective on the work that Pilobolus does, and also clear, you like what you're into Pilobolus, and Robert's into the stuff that we were doing. So that held, and just finding that connection and then being able to talk about that work more and more. You know, it's like, I'm somebody who will ask, if you're near me and I'm working on a new work, like, I'm probably going to ask you, like, what do you think about? Because I'm just trying to get all this information. And he kept saying these like really super helpful things about not just the dance making, but also what we haven't said actually, Robert, is that you also have, what am I saying, like a history, experience in the nonprofit world. Like, you work at the museum. And so like a lot of the kind of behind the scenes thing, that if I go, yeah, I got a board meeting, he knows what that means. And we just kept having these like overlaps of information. And you're right, Robert. I feel like at some point, I'm a pretty transparent like, I tell everybody like lots of stuff. We did start talking more and more about the new work we were working on, Renee and I's relationship. And our friendship spans over a time where Pilobolus went through a lot of changes. We had a different executive director. We had, from the time that the directors were starting to choreograph less and less, and I was doing more and more. He was there for all of the Shadowland. I think one of the first few people to see, we invited him and a couple other friends to the Palace Theater in Connecticut and Waterbury. And he saw one of the very first iterations, which is very different from the show now, because we got a lot of input and made a lot of changes and things like that. So I guess my point is that it makes perfect sense that Robert would write this book, because he has the care, the love, and insights on art and art making that lets him see things that other people might not see. And actually, even from before the book, we're making connections for me, as just having a friend who goes, what have you thought of this relationship with, especially with because it's such a collaborative, there's a lot of dealing with all of that. And it was just always seemed fruitful. So it was always really helpful. And I guess grew from that. I know it's weird to think back on any friendship and go, I don't know why, because
I know
the universe there, and it lined up, and there we are. We're so lucky to have found each other. Just I feel like with lots of people, it's a miracle.
I know it's like a weird question to ask, but I just feel like so much of your relationship is what kind of shaped the narrative, like the subcontext really in the book. And so I think it's like really important to understand and hear from both of your perspectives, like what that relationship is, and hearing how it spanned over time too provides like some more details.
There is no one who could write a book about what Pilobolus actually is. There's not an academic book about just the choreography or something like that without deeply understanding the relationships that produce these collaborative works.
I really want to dive into talking about the book, I guess, from a more zoomed out view. In the book, Rob, you pose the question, what is Pilobolus? And then you further state, not so much, and I'm quoting, to reinvent itself, but to unfold and exercise an inner language. In its case, one embodied in a physical movement vocabulary that has now spread throughout and beyond the dance world. And for me, after reading this book, I feel like so much of the inner language of Pilobolus, it seems to be really developed and shaped by the dancers and the leaders of the company and the community. And here at No Box Dance, we're constantly having the conversation about the accessibility and interest in dance as an art form. And what's really exciting about this conversation for me is to have you here, Rob, somebody who doesn't necessarily identify as a dancer, which is unique in our show. And oftentimes dance works are made for dancers versus dance made for a more general audience. And I'm wondering if you can both talk about how Pilobolus breaks this barrier and creates work that's enjoyed by people everywhere, both in live performance, but also on the screen.
Yeah, I think my answer to that would be that in its origins, in its formation, Pilobolus was created by people who mostly did not think of themselves as dancers. As I tell that story in the book, it was created by guys who were athletes who did not think of themselves as dancers. They were in college. They had senses of humor that were collegiate, horsing around, energetic senses of humor and comedy. And that found its way, the athletics and the humor found its way together into the first piece they made in a class taught by Allison Chase, who was teaching dance in a very unusual, new, fresh way at Dartmouth at that moment. And I think Pilobolus had baked into its DNA right at the beginning this idea of not thinking of yourself as dance, thinking of yourself as creating something fresh and fun and playful and witty. And I think everything that followed from that, even the more serious pieces that followed, they grew out of this sense of play and this original idea of a different energy. And it turns out it's also a more accessible energy.
I taught this little masterclass before this interview. And it's so nice to have somebody else explain what this is so succinctly, like a writer, because I'm like, see, there are these guys, I'm not quite as linear about it. So it's, oh, wow, I need to just record that. I love this question, partly because it makes me, maybe because because I don't have a traditional dance background. So since I don't have formal dance training and I feel sometimes like an outside artist, I mean, I most of the time that's how I would categorize myself to myself. Like, I'm not comparing. I'll tell you something. Oh, you're going to love this, Robert. We haven't even talked about this. I was watching a video of the new duet. I will show it to you, but it's on a hard drive on a plane somewhere. But I may have lost a hard drive for everyone to know. But anyway, doesn't matter because it's all good to go. Anyway, I'm watching this video, and one of the dancers in it, because of what they were wearing, started saying emotionally, I have to not, this is making me think I'm judging myself through a ballet lens or like my dance training lens. And it was upsetting to them that it was like, that's not what people are seeing. The audience isn't going, oh, is that ballet move look like the thing I see, those pictures on the wall? So like that you're trying to emulate. When part of the thing of Pilobolus, when you were talking about checking your ego at the door and the collaborative thing and getting over it, which is much easier to say than to do, we definitely have, I'm not going to BS and say that like we don't have an aesthetic and we don't have a style and we don't have certain things that we're drawn to, but we are constantly in a state of, we're trying to be in a state of play where where our cortisol and our adrenaline is like relatively low so that we can make mistakes and try new things. The way that our insurance against mediocrity is our ability to lean into mistakes and try new stuff. If we wanted to make sure that no one ever felt like we weren't going to take a chance, even in the studio when we were building it, we weren't willing to make mistakes. So there is something about, it happened last night. We are at the show and I get the guy that grabs me by my elbow while I'm talking to someone who clearly is a fan. And he says, my buddy here brought me. And I had no idea what to expect. And I just thought, and I loved it. And it's a code word for, I thought I was going to watch dance and feel like I didn't know what was going on and feel stupid. And I think that's a really bad thing. I think many companies are out there, even well-established ones, that are also fighting this. They don't actually, Graham she was using non-technically trained dancers in those early days that I just found out how that kind of happened in a conversation with Graham. So I think it's a hard thing where you end up solidifying this thing and dance has become about the technique instead of the technique being used to tell a story. And I think for me, that's what helps me keep from getting sucked in. Because the danger now with a legacy company is we could do it. I could be like, that's not Pilobolus enough. And in being not Pilobolus and trying to be too Pilobolus, I could end up not being Pilobolus because our whole thing is just what you're saying. That crossing that bridge. It's pop art, it's high art, and the other thing, Marthea, is that I try not to think about that very much. I don't know when I'm in the making that it's very helpful. I'm just thinking I want a lot of people to like it. And I have a sense, I'm fortunate now to have a sense of what our audience is. I'm not building that from scratch. That's one of the great things about coming into this after it was 25 years. My first year was just after the 25th anniversary. So some of that kind of got built in. It's also a mystery and maybe it should stay that way a little bit, but I don't know. What do you think?
I feel in our conversations, we're trying to figure out what's that recipe for staying true to the art, whatever that means, but then also not making dance feel like it's this like elitist experience that you have to be a dancer to understand what you're seeing. And it feels like a lot of dance that I see, it feels like that. Like I have my MFA in dance. So when I go to the show with my husband, I'm like looking for certain things like the technique, like you're talking about. But then like my husband will be like, I was bored out of my mind. Oh, that's interesting. Right. It like makes me think about my own experience in a different way. What I guess we're trying to figure out, like, what are those elements? Is it in the process? Is it casting people who aren't necessarily dancers, whatever that means? But what are those different elements to find that balance? Yeah. So you're not just making work for dancers.
I was just going to, I relate.
Go ahead, Robert.
I relate to something you just said, Marthea, about the elitism. It's like this question, some people perceive something as elitist or pretentious or because they maybe require some specialized knowledge or training or connoisseurship to appreciate it. And I think the same thing exists with a certain kind of literary writing. I'm a literary background, and there's a certain approach to writing fiction or nonfiction even, but it's especially true with fiction and poetry, that people who are schooled in it in an MFA program or even at an undergraduate level and have studied the history of literature think that there's a certain way to write something, and often it's not as accessible to the person who just wants to pick up a book and read it and read a good story. So those issues are ones that I think all different kinds of artists have to navigate. And I think in a way, the dance world is a place where it's in sharper relief in some ways, because somehow dance has become even more perceived as something or a more elite audience perceived that way by some people.
I've been thinking about this a lot because I think that you're right. It has this perception, and yet all people dance. Like all we want to
Yeah,
have
we
a body.
saw it, like, especially during the pandemic, like on TikTok, everybody's making dances. So it's why is there such a challenge?
I do. And Mark, this relates to, I think I'm skipping ahead because I know you're going to ask about platforms. I have this line, and I think I stole it from somebody. So if somebody knows, put in the comments in YouTube where this came from, because it's not I don't think I came up with this. People talk about, look what TikTok has done for dance. Because of the pandemic, it just exploded it. And I go, oh no, I think you're wrong. Look what dance did for TikTok.
Yeah.
Like, it's not, we got it backwards. And we all have, it's like when you speak a language. So I'm from the South. I grew up in Georgia. And when I moved to the Northeast, there's people talk differently. And sometimes you can feel judged when you live in one place and people talk one way and you talk another way. But it's impossible for a native speaker to use incorrect grammar. So when we talk about grammar, we're talking about, what do they call it? What do they call it? The marketplace vernacular or something. It's something like that. You're using the language of the people who control the money, or in whatever field you're in. So it's what I'm trying to get at is, this is no box, right? This is like, how do you think outside the box? And sometimes dance puts itself in a box by going, you can't say that. You're not supposed to say, me and Robert wanted to do it. You're supposed to say Robert and I. And yet everyone knows what I'm saying. It's not like it's confusing. And so when you watch a dance on stage, if that feeling is getting across, to me, that has to be more important than the syntax, than the grammar, the vernacular that you're using in that moment. When we made The Tempest, and Pilobolus went and created a vocabulary for a two-person Caliban and a bunch of other things for the show, and this was with Aaron Posner and Teller, the magician. Teller said to me, we're making this for the husbands. So it's funny that you said that about your husband. And then he went on to say, you don't have to be a man to be a husband. You don't have to be a husband to be a husband. You just have to be someone that went to the show because somebody told them that they needed to go to this. And that's that moment that I feel so grateful for, when someone says, I thought I was going to have to know a bunch of stuff and I didn't. Because all you need to bring when you see a Pilobolus to understand Pilobolus is yourself. You don't have to, and some pieces aren't going to be for everybody. Some pieces are a little more abstract and some pieces aren't. But it's like Robert's book. I think part of the reason that this book is, look at that, so great is that you don't have to be a dance historian, or it's a page turner. It's about the relationships between people and what emerged from that. I just think what you're talking about is really important for the future of dance.
And as you're talking to Matt, I think like another attribute of Pilobolus that does break that barrier, that makes the husband, and I'm air quoting, want to see Pilobolus and have a great experience, is this idea of world making. And Rob, you talk a lot about that. It feels like a through line in the book to me, especially when talking about Shadowland and Shadowland 2. And I'm wondering if you could pinpoint the creative strategies that made this world creation successful and resonate with audiences worldwide.
Yeah, I think that the concept of world making, maybe that phrase came about because Renee Jaworski was saying to me that at one point she said, Pilobolus doesn't really make dances. We make miniature worlds that exist on stage. And she said that, and I thought it was such a fantastic line, so articulate. And I quoted it in the book. And I think it's so interesting when you say that to me now, world making, because I think of the worlds that Pilobolus creates on stage as created through evocation. They're evoking worlds. When I think of someone making a world, I think of something incredibly complicated and detailed and filled with information. And I feel that what Pilobolus and many artists do is they evoke a world that we as audience members create in our mind. And like we're creating a lot of it because they're doing things that they know are going to tap into images or ideas or stories that we know. And they're playing off of the culture. An example of that, for example, an example of that would be in the piece Untitled, which is one of their most famous works. It ends with the two women in rocking chairs, rocking back and forth. But there are no rocking chairs on the stage. There is no rocking chair there. They are rocking it, and we know what it is. It's two women as they're growing older in their rocking chairs. And you can only do that if you know that everyone in the audience will recognize that image. They know this trope of the women, the ladies in their rocking chairs on their porches. So I think that's a lot of how it's created, that it's people going into the studio and knowing how to, or maybe they're finding by trial and error, buttons they can push in the audience. It's almost like the audience is an instrument that they're going to play. And I think that's how I think of it. And I'll hand it over to Matt to say how he thinks of it.
You are listening to Mailbox Dance.
That's pretty darn good. Yeah, Renee's thought about world building. It's like another way to say it is that you're creating, there's an element of constraint in it. Once you start defining a world and it starts to, okay. So part of the way that this happens to me is that since Pilobolus is a collaborative, both with the dancers and other directors and choreographers, or whoever we're collaborating with to create, other creators, makers, and truly collaborative, the pieces that we have, when we create a piece, when I think we're at our best, you can see in these pieces emergent qualities that weren't in the minds necessarily or intention of any of the individuals who started to create it. So you take an airplane apart and none of the parts possess the quality of flying, but if you put them together in a certain way, it possesses the quality of flying. Culture is like that. Nobody decides what culture is going to be like. It's just a bunch of things happen and it forms this thing. There's a point in the dance making that Renee and I've been talking about lately where none of the collaborator, I guess you might almost describe like losing the need or maybe sometimes even the desire to explain it in words. Like in the early stages, we're like, it's like this, and we're trying to come up with metaphors. And then there's a certain point where you're like, oh, that's it. And then it starts to just, everyone can agree. And you have to pay attention, because if I say that's in the world and you go, I don't think it is, then it's, wait a minute, X marks the spot. Why did you say that? What's going on in there? We dig in and maybe there's some little thing that needs to be adjusted. So and I understood your question a little bit differently too, when you talk about the strategies. So in the studio, when we're creating the work, part of it is the space that you create in and not fighting against it. If I'm going to make a dance about nature, like for example, our piece Branches, and I'm doing it in a basement studio that's really dark with fluorescent lighting in the city, and as soon as I come out, I'm swept off into the city energy or whatever, that's going to not work for me. And it's going to be hard to maintain that world. So you have to know where you are, the size of the ceiling. Like we sometimes pick what sections we're going to work on based on the studio space that we have available. So like smaller spaces, more intimate, more detailed work, bigger spaces, lofty, aspirational things like that. They call that the cathedral effect. And it's been studied the way it like adjusts your mind. I also use music a lot. And I don't mean the music that you will hear in the dance. So a lot of times the pieces that we create are made, the worlds that we create are evoked through the use of music that might not end up being on in the thing at all. In fact, recently there's a wonderful organization in New York called Flight Path. It's a after school dance program. Yeah, you should check them out, because it's I think the ages are like 14 to maybe 21 or something like that. So it's this multiple ages and they all come together and they make dances. And we created a Pilobolus dance with Erica Jumbo, who's one of the beautiful dancers of Pilobolus. And Jumbo and she did a lot of it, and I would come in and consult. And one day I came in and I played some music that my 15-year-old son has been rowing to, which is a band called Turnstile. It's like what I would call skater music. And they were like, what is, because they were used to arpeggiated new age things that you get to, and it's interesting because sometimes the dancers, the Pilobolus dancers will really enjoy that music because they can put their own, it's a pad, a drone that they can put their own accents on. But if you're working with younger dancers, sometimes I find the need to give them something that's very different than what they're expecting or what they're used to, that has a kind of energy that like elevates them. And then once they get going and you feel this, then you take that music away and then they can play on top of something else. And that is a big part of the world building. What people wear, I just think it's, the more we're talking about it, it's not you come in and you punch a time clock and then you're like, I guess I better go on Pilobolus, and then you're in that world. It's like, I was telling Robert, sometimes the drive, I have two ways that I can go to Piloboland when I'm working from my house. And both of them are beautiful. But one way is a little more scenic. It takes a little bit longer. It's a little bit more hilly. I pass horses. I pass a land trust. It's beautiful. And I will actually choose that way if I feel like I need to be in that kind of a mindset, even if it was going to make me late, because it's so important to come in a certain mind frame. I don't know if that helps explain that sort of, that's world building that you're talking about. It is very interesting.
It really does, because I think it helps give some like practical tips for our listeners to try out in their own as they're trying to figure out what they want to create. I think it's helpful to hear what works for you. And
sometimes you can, that music, if you play something very different, you'll know. So remember I was saying, like, sometimes I try and let's find like a bunch of songs that don't work. And because if you find one that everyone goes like, no way, that tells you a lot about what that world is. As opposed to trying to find the right thing, you're like, all these things don't work. So what does that tell us?
That's a really helpful strategy also when working with collaborators, as you mentioned, because I think oftentimes like storyboarding can be great, but it's like, it's sometimes so open that it's like, you need some I sometimes need some framework to push against. So I love how you're talking about this idea of knowing what it's not can lead you to maybe what it is or what it might be. And I want to hear, if you're willing to share a little bit about the worlds that Pilobolus is looking to create in the future.
So the worlds that we are interested in the future, there's two of them that I will share with you. So I mentioned that we did a version of The Tempest that with Aaron Posner. We fell in love with that world of The Tempest that so much that we thought, what if we made a dance piece that took place on the island of The Tempest before it and after the events in the play? So the play is all about these colonials that land on this island and then jump into control and jump into all of the beings and creatures and spirits that live there. We're like, wait, like they had a life before and they had a life afterwards. Ariel at the end is released and is free. What does he do? Where does he go? What does freedom mean to him? So we're talking to Aaron Posner about doing a piece that's based on this world that was imagined by Shakespeare, but like from a different angle than you normally hear. And the other one is the reason I was talking about Graham is that they are coming up on their, can you believe it, 100th anniversary. And it's amazing. As part of that celebration, Pilobolus is going to create 3 variations of Martha Graham's Lamentation. This is the piece, Robert, where she's in the bag and everything, the stretchy thing. And I love this idea because there are many people that go like, Graham, Pilobolus, what? How? But it relates to the story that you were telling before about the accessibility of dance. Yeah, duh. Of course, we love Grant. Like this is going to be great. So we're thinking about where that world, and it may be in 3 different worlds because there's 3 different variations of it, but it'll all be in a membrane.
And that's an incredibly exciting match for another reason, which I will point out, which is that part of the special magic of Pilobolus was that the rough and tumble guys that I was talking about earlier, the college guys who started it, they were then joined by Allison Chase, their teacher, and Martha Clark, who had these incredible backgrounds in dance. And it was the combination of those two things and the tug of war between those energies that gave Pilobolus its signature kind of identity. So the idea of Martha Graham meets Pilobolus is fabulous. It's a little bit like Martha Clark meets Pilobolus.
Yeah.
Flash forward.
I want to go ahead and move into our final segment, which we call our Flash 4. This is where we like to ask all our guests to answer 4 questions in a flash. If you had to recommend a resource to our audience, what would it be?
Okay, so the resource I want to recommend is a library, and it's real libraries, like the kind you go to that are building, whether it's your public library or a college library, if you're lucky enough to have access to a college library. And the recommendation is that you don't look in a card catalog or on any screens, but that you walk among printed books and wander without at any time constraints and find discoveries that you would never find otherwise, because they won't come up in one of those websites where it says, oh, you like that? You might also like this. Instead, you'll find something you would never have found.
Oh man, I escape the algorithm. Okay, the resource. Gosh, there's so many. I get so much inspiration from many things. Lately, I've been listening a lot to a guy named Adam Grant. He wrote a book called Rethink, and he has a great podcast called Rethink, and it's just about viewing things different than you thought they, like asking yourself, what have you changed your mind about? How do you keep learning?
What was the first dance you saw?
The first time I ever saw a live dance was the Joffrey Ballet I think it was either in the fall of 81 or the winter of 82. I was a freshman in college, and it really blew me away because I had seen dance on television, but I had never seen people on stage doing amazing. To me, it was amazing. I had grown up reading Marvel comics, superhero comics, and here were these people on stage doing these things that seeing them live in front of me doing this stuff was amazing.
First dance. Wow. So like concert, I saw the touring Broadway shows when they came through Atlanta. I would volunteer usher at the Fox theaters where I could see stuff. There was that kind of thing. But I think the first only dance, here's what my answer would be. There was a girl in high school when we were seniors, and she had taken dance for life. And I went with her parents and saw her concert and from her studio. And it was just so not what I was expecting, because they did modern and they did jazz and they did all these different things. And she was so beautiful, and I wasn't expecting that kind of thing. And she is the woman who, when I went to college, we went to the same college, University of Georgia, said, you should come by the dance department because it reminds me of the way you talk about martial arts. Like they talk about it differently. And she sucked me into that world. And I guess in the spirit of why you're asking it, I don't think any of this would happen if I hadn't just gone and seen this very well done local dance studio performance.
And here you are now.
Where I am now. I'm trying to remember what the artwork are. Pilobolus was one of the first, at that tier, was one of the first dance companies that I saw.
Do you think social media has a positive influence on the dance world, yes or no?
I think the answer is yes, no, maybe, and all of the above. Because I think that social media is like sex, religion, and technology, in that it is an energy and it is as good or bad as what you do with it.
I think that social media is a very powerful new technology, and all really powerful new technologies. We have to be very respectful of the things that it can change and the things that it can do. I would like to be optimistic and say that it is positive. I do think that anybody that thinks it doesn't have negative things for negative impacts on the dance community is not really looking at it. And anyone who thinks that it has no positive benefits for the dance community is also not looking at it. That's why you're asking the question, right? Because it's such a clear thing. But I will say that last night, a family came to the show and I said, the parents said no, and they had two little girls that looked like they were maybe 9 and 13. And I said, how did you find out about the Pilobolus? And they pointed at the kids and the kids said, we saw you on YouTube or TikTok or whatever it was. I think it was YouTube, and brought their parents. So I think in that way, we can't put the genie back in the bottle, and there are younger and younger people that are going to be brought into the world of dance through that social media. I just think we have to be careful that we don't mistake social media, like dance that's made for a phone, as for dance that's made in person, because they're not the same.
What is your favorite social media platform?
My favorite is definitely YouTube. I love the access it gives me to videos. I'll admit that mostly it's pop music that I'm there for, and occasionally other things. I also love the fact that it's like other aspects of the internet. It's international, and I'm a Francophile, so going to YouTube and being able to see my favorite French performers and sometimes French films, or I learn French instructional stuff. YouTube. It's definitely YouTube.
Let's see. I think the one I interact with the most on a personal level is also YouTube. And for dance, I probably see more dance on Instagram than anything else. But it's only when someone else goes, hey, look at this.
That's fair. So I think a great way to close out this interview is answering this question. How are you saying no to the box?
I guess I can say, I think the way to say no to the box is to constantly ask questions, to question what you're doing, and to think, if you're an artist of any kind, to say, what's the logical thing or the typical thing that someone would do next at this point? And what can I do instead of that? And so the example in my own life right now is that I'm working on my next book, and it's a different kind of book than I've ever written before. It's not a book about a dance company. It's not another attempt at fiction like the privately printed previous attempts at fiction. It's a fantasy novel, which is really different for me. But it's not a completely illogical next step, because it's got a lot of levitation in it, and so does Pilobolus.
I have two ways. One, they're related. First, you have to know that you're in a box. You have to realize what is keeping you in place, because sometimes those things are not what you think they are. And the way that I would do that is to encourage people to question not everything, but pick one or two givens that you have to have music for dance. Oh, let's try it without music. Try something that like seems impossible, that is a given that you have to, that the people say you have to do. And the other way that I find I do this, and I've done this my whole life, is a smart ass. So I want to like be in the box, but screw up the reason that you're in the box. And our kids show, minor example, no big deal. And so it's an easy one to explain. But we had decided that the old Pilobolus shirts all had to have the Pilobolus word written on it, like the Pilobolus logo. So we wrote them. We had a friend of ours draw them, and there were several shirts. One is in sign language, one is in Morse code, one is in, and it was just not that anybody would get in trouble. Like, it wasn't a hard and fast rule, but it was just like, how can I do the thing that you're following the rules, but do it in a way that produces something very different than what that rule was put in place for? That's always fun to me, where I'm like, it's like cheating, like being a teenager. I'm following the rules. I just did it differently.
I really appreciate you both taking the time to come on our show today. I feel like we had such an interesting conversation, and we were able to talk about so many different topics. And I'm just really grateful, Rob, for you for writing this book. How can our listeners get this book?
Look, the book is Published by University Press of Florida, and it will be available through all the usual channels. Your favorite bookstore can get it for you, or your favorite online bookseller. It will be available through all the usual ways.
Thank you, Rob. And Matt, hearing about the new worlds that you're exploring with Pilobolus is really exciting. And I'm sure our listeners will want to catch the next show as it's coming to a place near you. So how can our listeners stay connected with Pilobolus?
Go to the webpage, get on the newsletter, and we're working harder and harder to, what do they call that, where it's tagged? So we'll alert you when you're in your area, but just check back in and just stay in touch. And you can always just go to the website and reach out to us. We love interacting with our audience.
Thank you both again. This was such a special conversation, and I hope we can do it again sometime.
Anytime. I always love it. You guys are doing great. I love what you're doing.
Thank you so much for having us.
Dance Behind the Screen podcast is produced by Novox Dance, an art service organization that creates, collaborates, and discusses art with artists and the public. Dance Behind the Screen podcast is co-hosted by Azaria Hogans, Raina Mondragon, Marthea Nygaard, and Yejin Choi, with sound designed by Daniel Rosas.
Thanks for taking your time to tune into Dance Behind the Screen, a bi-monthly interview series where we go behind the screen to question process, product, and social media. Be sure to follow us on social media at KNOW Box Dance. See you next time, and don't forget to say no to the box.